mean, first of all, just as a principle, putting these three aside, because I just want to make sure we're okay with these three specifically. But as a general principle, does that work for the group?
Yeah, I think they're important principles. How each individual weighs or how much weight they give each of these, that's up to each of us individually. But as far as being a principle in itself, that should be considered. I agree strongly.
Right. And as I said before, to your point, that there are 10 principles. We may add one before we're over here. There are 10 guiding principles here, and it'll be maybe possible, but not easy, right, for all of these to be operating in our final decision. That's part of the process that we're going to need to work through together and figure out what we can live with, right, and what we think is the best decision in the name of the common good. So as a general principle, does that work? That we'll continually to collectively put our knowledge together as we're working through these. But I want to come back to the three specific bullets and make sure you're okay with these. I don't want to just move off these. Are you okay with the perceptions and emotional status of faculty and staff being on this list as a guiding principle? We're okay on that, right? Okay. Then the second one is the emotions and perceptions of families of victims and survivors are very influential. That belongs on this list, correct? Okay. Lastly, the opinions of Sandy Hook school parents and community, I want to underscore, and community, must be considered, right, on this list, right? Okay. All right. Now I just want to take a second. I want to try to wrap this up in the next few minutes to make sure that George and Rob have enough time to go through the technical criteria. Are there any things that you think we haven't talked about that we should consider being on this list? Yes, please. Yeah.
Microphone.
Microphone, Bob.
Microphone says opinions of Sandy Hook school parents and community. Is that Sandy Hook community, or is that community in the large?
Thoughts?
I mean,
I can tell you what was meant by the author.
I would assume it's Sandy Hook. But.
It is. And again, understand that the constituent groups that are teasing out these principles are focused on the Sandy Hook community in particular, which is why it's narrowly focused.
I'm okay with that. I just wanted, I mean, you know, English kind of thing.
You just want to be sure.
Specific, parenthetically, or whatever the right thing.
Thanks. Okay. Any ones we want to add to this?
Rich,
Jim?
I just maybe I missed it, but did we miss both short and long?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I did that. I didn't. So did I not do that? No. I'm sorry. I apologize. Thanks. Good catch. So let me come back to that. Thanks, Jim. Both short and long. This is the third from the bottom. Both short and long-term thinking should guide site selection and building design. Joe?
Yeah, that to me, I was going to raise that myself, because that sort of is somewhat contradictory, because it opens the door for a much broader viewpoint of what's going to happen, of what's going on in the town. And, you know, from my perspective, you know, I sit on the Board of Finance, you know, it seems to me there should be a financial component here as a guiding principle as well. And the reason I say that is because directionally, we're in 6 years, we're going to have 1,000 less students than we have right now. And you know, in addition to that, in that same time frame, we're slated to spend upwards of $10 million to rehabilitate the Hawley School. So, you know, when you take those two things into consideration, you know, are we setting ourselves up for a situation where we're building perhaps one brand new school without any considerations of the overall space needs of the town, and then a few years from now saying, geez, why do we do that? You know, we maybe should have put a couple of schools together. And so I'm interested to see what the various sites are, because maybe that broadens our scope later on. But I think there's room for another principle here, is why I guess I'm
About financial?
Well, yes.
And, okay, other thoughts about this?
No, I just would second it, though. I mean, I think it's almost irresponsible not to have a financial component on this. And I don't care who pays for it, if it's the state or the federal government or whatever. I mean, it's our money as citizens.
Okay.
So I think it's got to be added.
Other thoughts? Yeah,
Do we
John?
know who's paying for this? Do we know who's paying for this?
Well, we think we know, John, but
What-
that's always, I think, tinged with uncertainty.
Yes.
Until we have a final commitment and we actually have contracts and that kind of stuff. I think it's always questionable, even though we know all of us heard the same commitments over and over again, particularly in that first 6 weeks or so after December 14. And each of our state legislators and the federal delegation also committed those resources. But again, I urge caution always on that assumption. The only observation I would make, if we're going to add to the guiding principles, that we create another column or another area down, because don't forget the guiding principles, the 10 that are here, were derived from constituent conversations. So if we add to those, which I think is fine, we should separate it out because it does not reflect a conversation held with the community constituent groups.
Very quickly, but it's already there. I mean, if you're going to include long-term planning, you've got to include some additional principles in order to meet a long-term plan, unless, you know, long-term means right here.
I think there's a difference between including a long-term thinking and making a decision here as a group that we're going to close another school. I think those can be potentially two different things. You know, a component of long-term planning might be, you know, we may not want to build a school in an area that doesn't have city water because that doesn't make sense if we're planning a school for 50 years. Another component of long-term planning, you know, might be, let's build a school that's similar in size to what we had before because we know in X number of years we're going to have less kids and that will give us room to make changes 5, 6, 7 years forward, which is part of long-term planning. It doesn't mean we have to make our decision today, I don't think, based on all of those things. I also, while I think, you know, whether or not we pay for it through state, local, or federal funds, it is still something we're going to pay for, so I can understand the concern about funding. But I don't think that should guide our decision. I think we need to make a decision that's right for the community, and then, and right for the community in terms of what's good for our children and going forward in the long term, and then figure out a way to make that work.
And,
Jim?
yeah, and I agree 100% with Mary Ann.
If you speak up more, please.
Sure, I agree 100% with Mary Ann. If we're going to talk about some long-term potential benefit, that's great. But if we're going to put in this agenda or in this work, are we going to close a school or are we going to build a school because our intent is to close a school? That's a potentially very divisive and distracting issue, which can't necessarily be decided by this group or will be decided in the next year or two. So it may be distracting to the point where, yes, let's take a look at some things like Mary Ann said with respect to some long-term planning, but I certainly wouldn't want to start making decisions based on closing schools and what have you, because then I could see that we may come to no consensus.
I just have two comments to make. One, the long-term planning examples that came up with the constituent conversations had more to do with the point that Mary Ann raised in terms of infrastructure. It's not that those other considerations aren't important, but one of the observations that came up is the presence of city water, sewers, gas lines, those kinds of things as being part of the long-term plan of development of the community. But again, it doesn't exclude other considerations. The second thought is that when we're looking at the site options, we might want to revisit that space needs plan of the Board of Education and say what was determined 2 years ago in that space needs plan, and can we find a response to this problem that is in alignment with that plan? So I don't think it's going to be inconsistent. So I think we can do that when we look at the options.
Joseph, does that help in terms of how we move forward, so you can live with that? So we've got the financial stuff on the table. We'll work through that and see where that comes up. And if you don't think we're adequately dealing with it, I hope you raise it as we move through this. Other points? Yes, George.
And it could be that we draw a line, because if these are the guiding principles as teased out from the conversations with the Sandy Hook families, then that's those. But I want to revisit the principle that whatever we do here brings us together as a community.
Right. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what that means, what that might mean.
Well, it means that we have a community that's willing to, the resource question needs to be had, but the guidance we've gotten from our federal and state legislators is decide what it is that you as a community want to do. And I think when you're having that conversation, it's a conversation that has to be had by the entire community, meaning Newtown. And it is specifically, we need to take care of our Sandy Hook families, and we need to do something to try to nurture this special population of kids and families as we go forward as a community. And we need to have a consensus within the greater community that that's what a defining part of what we want to do. That's not as easily accomplished as it is said.
Right. Thoughts on this?